This session is about my entry into the service in 1957. I was commissioned at Virginia Tech, VPI at that time, as part of the graduation. But that commissioning was for a reserve commission, and that occurred in June the 9th of that year. I went home and had a couple of weeks before I was to go to Fort Benning. On the 24th of June, a neighbor, Captain Ike Broadus, came to Mom's house early in the morning, swore me in as a regular Army officer, and then I said goodbye to Mom and headed for Fort Benning, Georgia. There were no interstate roads in those days, so it was a long trip, and it took 2 days. I stopped the first night in Greenville, South Carolina, right across from Bob Jones University. And then I went on the next day and went to Victory Drive in Columbus, Georgia, and stayed in a motel there. The motel there in Columbus is still in place. It's right across from where the old Baker High School was. And then I got up the next morning and reported in for duty. I learned that I would be in a class with West Point graduates who were also regular Army officers, and that class was not to start for a month and a half or 2 months. And so I was assigned to different jobs on the post awaiting the beginning of the basic infantry officer class. At one point I was assigned to a tank battalion, and I was showing some troops one day how to drive a shell casing into the ground, and we put it alongside of a sidewalk, and it made it look kind of nice. So I had a sledgehammer, and I was hitting the thing really hard, and I suddenly felt a strong pain in my chest, and I pretended like there wasn't any problem, and then finally kind of snuck off to the side and went to my car and lay down in the back seat. And I got to feeling better, and I left and finally went home, had supper. Pain was so bad I went to the hospital, and they said it was a spontaneous pneumothorax, that I had collapsed a lung. Well, I stayed in the hospital for a while until about time that the class was to start. And so I got out of the hospital, joined my class. The spontaneous pneumothorax had healed itself. It's a natural heal. During that class, I got to know a lot of the West Point infantry officers in the class of 1957, and throughout my career, I was run into them in the military from time to time. So that was a good opportunity for me. I finished the basic infantry officer training, which I think was about 19 weeks, and it was just before Christmas. And I went home to visit Mom again right before Christmas. And I remember that was a long drive after I left Benning to go home, and about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was trying to drive all the way through, which was tough. And I just couldn't make it any further, and I went to my grandmother's house, and Crew knocked on the door at about 2 in the morning and asked her if I could come in and sleep. I woke her up and shouldn't have done it. I should have just slept in the car. Anyway, I got home the next day and spent Christmas with Mom, and my orders called for me to go back to Benning to attend Ranger School right after Christmas. And I did so, and I started out in that Ranger class. And then about the third week, there are 3 phases to Ranger School. The Benning phase, which is about 3 weeks, the phase in the swamps, which is about 3 weeks down in Florida, and the phase in the mountains, which is in North Georgia, which is about 3 weeks. And about the end of the third week, we were coming back to the post from a exercise, and we had some physical training to do later in the afternoon. And the truck that a group of us were in was traveling too fast, and they said also driver got sun in his eyes, and he turned over, and that put a lot of us in the hospital. It broke my back and put me in the hospital till they could get a plaster Paris cast, a body cast. It ran from my hips up above my chin, so I couldn't turn my head, and up over the back of my head, to up the back of my head. But then I stayed in that. I was released from the hospital, but then I had to go find a BOQ, a place to sleep. So I got in the BOQ right next to the officers club, got my car and the items I had moved, and they gave me a room. So then my functioning then was pretty much stuck in that area between the BOQ, and I ate my meals at the officers club. And I finally asked them, they were trying to find something to do with me because it's hard to do anything with somebody in a body cast. I asked if I could attend a communications class that was going on there at Benning, which was about half Marines and half Army. And I monitored that class. I'd sit in the back, listen, got to know the guys in there. But then I finished off that class. I was in the body cast for 12 weeks, and then several other opportunities. I had to do some different training to fill up the whole 12 weeks. And then I got the body cast taken off, and then I was released. But I told them that I wanted to go back to Ranger School, but I was going to need an opportunity to get back in shape again. So I was assigned to the same companies, basic companies that I had trained with, but this time I was going to be a TAC officer or an executive officer in one of those companies. I remember that in one of those classes, the professional football players, guys that had been good in college and had been in ROTC, they were given the opportunity to have 6 months on active duty, and then they'd go back where they'd play their next year of professional football. In one of the classes I was in, Jim Brown, the famous football player, Jerry Tubbs, a guy named Bob Gunderman from University of Virginia, and Don Shinnick. Those four guys who were stars. In fact, Tubbs and Brown were candidates for the Heisman Trophy, but they neither one of them made it. But it was interesting classes that I went through, and finally I got to the point where I could go back to Ranger School, and I did so. I worked hard getting back in shape, running a lot, trying to be sure that I was ready to do the exercises, the rope climbs, and so forth that were necessary in Ranger School. Went back, started off. They knew that I had recovered from the truck accident that had occurred there, and I was made the company commander of the Ranger class, the student company commander. And all this time you're in these different positions, you're being graded on your leadership in that role. So as a student company commander at first, went through Benning, luckily no problems. I was assigned a guy by the name of Bob Chant. He's my Ranger buddy, and the guy you stayed with and looked after all the time. And interestingly enough, I'm still in contact with Bob. He lives in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and we talk from time to time by phone. But then we went to Florida, and there we went through the training there in the swamps. It really tore your feet up down there because your feet got so soft. And then finally, we went to the mountain phase where we trained, and then we came back and got our tabs at Fort Benning, where they had the tab pinned on. And I remember that when they pinned my tab on, a fella pinned it through my shirt and through the skin on my arm and then out the other side, so I couldn't get my shirt off without taking the Ranger tab off. And this was a guy named Tony Herbert, who had been fought with the Turkish army during Korea, and also was a hero of the Korean War. Dandridge Malone was another one of the trainers, and he had written quite a bit about the Army, and he became well known through the Army for his training. So from Ranger School, I graduated from Ranger School, and then I went to Airborne School. And at Airborne School, it was easy. I had to make the 5 jumps, but it was very easy because I'd just come out of Ranger School, which had been very taxing and tough on you. Finished there, and then I went back to the student battalion again for more time as an attack officer there until I got my orders. I told DA that I'd like to go to Germany and be assigned there, and I got my orders and was assigned to Germany in 1959.